This is Origin Stories, the Leakey Foundation podcast. I'm Meredith Johnson. The new year is finally here, and along with the reported 3/4 of all adults in America, I'm planning to make some changes in 2021. I'm making one of the most popular and basic New Year's resolutions: to improve my health and get more exercise. I'll admit this is not the first year I've promised myself to walk 10,000 steps a day or do yoga or lift weights 3 times a week. I make myself the same promise pretty much every year. And every year I feel bad about myself when it doesn't happen. But not this time. No more feeling bad. Because what if I told you that the reason it can be so hard to make exercise part of your life is because we never evolved to want to exercise? In fact, the opposite is true. My guest on the show today is Dan Lieberman. He's a professor of human evolutionary biology at Harvard University and a member of the Leakey Foundation's Scientific Executive Committee. He's an expert on the evolution of human physical activity, and he's the author of a new book called Exercised: Why Something We Never Evolved to Do is Healthy and Rewarding. The book is a natural history of human movement. And the central idea of the book is that even though we have powerful instincts that cause us to want to avoid exercise, we need it to be healthy, and we can use insights from anthropology and evolutionary research to change the way we think about it, and even make exercise more enjoyable for people like me who struggle to get going. If exercise is already part of your life, that's wonderful. This episode has something for you too, because there are lots of myths and conflicting information out there about health and fitness, and today we're going to answer some big questions. Is sitting really the new smoking? How much sleep should we be getting? Do you really need to walk 10,000 steps a day? Does running ruin your knees? Is it inevitable to lose strength as we age? Dan says in his book he wants to dispel these confusing ideas about exercise.
The book is meant to be an anti-BS book in some ways, right? Because there's so many myths out there about physical activity and exercise, because we have this kind of just strange, commercialized, medicalized, commodified approach to how we use our bodies. And really, I wanted to use the book as a way of exploring some of those ideas and how an evolutionary approach can help us think much more rationally and much better about many aspects of health, including exercise.
Dan's research is focused on the evolution of the human body and all the ways our bodies evolved to move. And he doesn't just study exercise, he does it too.
I've always been reasonably physically active. And one of the nice things, as I look back on my life, my parents played a really important role in that. My mother, and I actually wrote about her in the book, was a pioneer in the women's movement, and she did that partly by running. She didn't run because she wanted to run so much, but she ran to liberate the gym at the University of Connecticut, where they wouldn't let women into the gym. And that actually got her hooked on exercise. And they also liked to hike and to walk. And so I think ever since I was a kid, I grew up thinking that running and hiking and walking and all that were very important, normal parts of life.
In addition to everyday exercise, Dan has run marathons, and he's traveled the world studying how hunter-gatherers, subsistence farmers, and others use their bodies. He says whenever possible, he participates in what people are doing, and so he's tracked musk oxen with indigenous hunters in Greenland, joined traditional long-distance foot races in Mexico, and he's even competed in a 25-mile race against horses.
So when I ran that race in 2016, I'm just a mediocre athlete. I'm not a great athlete. I'm not fast. I've never won any race in my life. And yet, a middle-aged professor like me, even though I was not the fastest, I still beat. There were 53 horses, and I beat all but 13 of them. So I beat 40 horses.
Dan is well known for his research on the evolution of endurance running and the idea that somewhere around 2 million years ago, humans evolved the ability to run long distances. And this allowed our ancestors to outlast and run down animals much faster than themselves.
Because I've been writing about how humans can outrun animals, I thought I should try it one time. And so I put my money where my mouth is. It's one thing to theoretically read about it, and I'm not going to go and chase kudus and kill them in Africa. So this seems like the next best thing. So I signed up and flew over to Arizona, and it was delightful. It was charming. The guy who runs the race basically puts his wife's kitchen clock in a tree, and that's how he times everybody. And at the beginning of the race, it's 6 a.m. and there were like 40 something runners and 53 horses. And the runners go off first, and then the horses come along. And then of course, the horses immediately pass you because they're much faster. There's nothing like being passed by a giant thoroughbred horse, like in the first mile of a race, to make you feel really bad about being a human being. And then for the next 18 miles, I didn't see any horses. And the race goes up over this mountain in Arizona called Mount Mingus. And it's getting hotter and hotter because it's Arizona, and it's gorgeous, and it's hard running because you're going up a mountain. And I had bet my daughter that I could beat one horse. That was my bet, and I was beginning to feel like I was going to lose my bet. And then around mile 18 or mile 19, I saw my first horse, and I have to tell you, that was one of the best moments of my life. I felt my heart just leapt up into my chest, and I got this extra burst of energy, and we started passing horses, and I just, at that point, I got an incredible second wind. Starting around mile 20, you start going down, and there were these switchbacks, and I'm a good downhill runner, and I love running downhill, and I just tore off, and I started running down the mountain as fast as I could, just excited because I'd passed all these horses. And then towards the end, it levels out. And I remember there was one point when I was running to this dry riverbed, and there was another runner in front of me. I was trying to catch up to him. And then I heard some horses behind me. And there's nothing like the sound of horses behind you. And there's the thump and the breathing and whatever. And I was like, I had to, I'm not a very competitive person, at least when it comes to athletics, but oh my God, I had to beat those horses. And so I was running breakneck speed for me, jumping over logs and whatever, and the horses passed me, and I was so disheartened. But I knew that they were going to heading out into the open plain, and that they were going to get hot again. So I don't know, there was some switch that got turned on in my brain that just kind of kept me going. And I would say the best moment of my life in any race happened when I passed those two horses with about a half mile to go in the race. And I felt like Superman. And even though I ran a very pathetic time by marathon standards, like 4 hours and 20 minutes or something like that, I beat those two horses, and I beat 40 horses. And I had such a runner's high. It was just awesome. But the point is that you only have to beat one horse to win from an evolutionary perspective, because that's the horse I could have eaten. Not that I eat horses, but again, the way we think about these things, we're our elite athletes and races and all this sort of modern competition has perverted our view of physical activity and exercise. Too often we're comparing ourselves to the best of the best, people who spend their entire lives training to stand on one line and run 26.2 miles to another line. But that's not how we evolved. We evolved to be jacks of all trades, to do everything. You don't have to beat all the horses, you just have to beat one horse. And so I think, again, it's stepping out of the sort of modern framework, I think, is very helpful.
So, if we evolved with this incredible ability to run, to outlast faster animals over long distances, and if it feels so amazing, why is it so hard to get off my couch and do my YouTube yoga classes when I could be flying down mountain switchbacks, beating 40 horses in a race? Is that kind of athletic ability an innate human quality?
If you read in some popular accounts, you get this idea that people uncontaminated by civilization are naturally spectacular athletes who can just get out of bed and run ultra marathons and scale mountains easily and lift their body weight above their head without any effort. It's just nonsense, but it sounds good. It's truthiness. It sounds true, and we would like it to be true. And so there's a lot of money to be made by making people feel bad about themselves and feel that they're somehow inadequate or lazy or whatever. And I think we need to have a more compassionate approach towards people and their instincts. If you stand at the bottom of the stairs, one of those like subway stops where there's an escalator next to a stairway. And of course, our ancestors didn't have escalators, but it's an instinct to save energy and to do what's easy. And so 95% of people, no matter what country you're in, take the escalator. And yet we're made to feel bad for doing that. But it's an instinct, and it doesn't mean that we should always obey our instincts. Sometimes our slow brain canon should take over, but there's nothing wrong with you for wanting to take the escalator. And we shouldn't make people feel bad about it. For most of human evolutionary history, energy was limited, and you can't use a calorie twice. If I use a calorie taking the stairway, that means I can't spend that calorie on something else that natural selection cares about, which is reproduction. So our ancestors evolved to be physically active in order to survive, but they didn't evolve to do needless physical activity that didn't have any kind of benefit.
The truth of the modern industrialized world is that if you don't need to be physically active in order to survive, you have to exercise to be healthy. I probably don't need to define the word exercise, but I'll do it anyway. Exercise is defined as physical activity done solely for the sake of health and fitness. And if you think about it, it's kind of deeply weird because in the past, until quite recently, nobody did exercise for the sake of health.
They were physically active when it was necessary, or they were physically active when it was fun and socially rewarding, like dancing, for example, in the evening with other members of your group. That's why we evolved to be physically active. But nobody in the Stone Age got up and did what I did this morning, which is go out and run, 6 miles. And what made it particularly ridiculous was it was like 12 degrees here, too. It was like really horribly cold. And what on earth was I doing? If I was trying to explain that to a Hadza, or for that matter, your great grandparents, they would wonder, what on earth was I doing? Why was I out there needlessly in the freezing cold at 6:30 in the morning when it was still dark doing this ridiculous activity? And the answer is that we live in this world where we no longer have to do any physical activity, and we have to choose new ways to do it in this kind of voluntary fashion. And let's not pretend it's normal and natural. It isn't. Is it good for us? Yes. But is it normal and natural? Absolutely not. And yet somehow we're made to feel that there's something wrong with that. And to think about the Nike, logo, just do it. That's a really useless slogan for the vast majority of human beings. Just do it doesn't help you do it. We need to find better and more effective ways to help people choose to do something now, which is exercise, that we have millions of years of adaptations that urge us to do the opposite.
Anthropologists often look to modern hunter-gatherers to learn about health differences between people living traditional lifestyles and others who live more industrialized, non-traditional lifestyles.
We can learn a lot from hunter-gatherers in the sense that for most of human evolutionary history, we were hunter-gatherers. And in fact, it was only 600 generations ago that we first invented farming. And so it's been a blink of an eye since we stopped being hunter-gatherers. So our bodies evolved for those kinds of environments. That said, I think hunter-gatherers are not, a paragon of health, and we shouldn't just hold them up and say, if the Hadza do it, Hadza are a famous group of hunter-gatherers in northern Tanzania, Hadza do it, we should do it. Because remember, we didn't evolve to be healthy. We evolved to have as many offspring as possible who survive and reproduce. So we evolved to be healthy only to the extent that health promotes reproductive success. So just because the Hadza do it doesn't mean we should do it, but it does tell us something about the kinds of conditions that we evolved in and helps us evaluate what's different and normal versus abnormal about our Western world. And so much of what we do is very weird, and reading is abnormal. Nobody read until recently. Learning math, going to school, going to the dentist. These aren't necessarily bad things, but they're abnormal. And so by stepping outside of our world and thinking about what's normal and abnormal helps us evaluate the costs and the benefits in a much more rational way. Because we live in a world in which, we have lots of carbohydrates, and we live in social environments where we have to contribute to the common good. And since we've removed the necessity to do physical activity to survive, we don't walk 5 to 10 miles every day and dig up tubers or pick berries and climb trees and run after animals. We now have to find other ways to be physically active. And that becomes more and more important as we get older. And the reason for that is that, again, bodies are stingy, and you don't want to spend calories on something that doesn't really benefit your reproductive success. That's what at least natural selection cares about.
So maybe natural selection doesn't care if we're healthy, but I do. I want us all to be healthy and enjoy our lives as much as we can. But it can be confusing to figure out the best things to do. So we're going to address some myths about human physical activity, starting with some about inactivity. Myth number 1, sitting is the new smoking.
So it's become a kind of mantra that sitting is the new smoking. And that there's one guy who even wrote, for every hour in your chair, 2 hours of your life, walk away forever, which is obviously, if you do the math, ridiculous. But the fact of the matter is that it's not abnormal to sit, and that around the world, everywhere you go, people mostly sit. And there was even a recent study of hunter-gatherers, and they sit 9 to 10 hours a day, pretty much as most Westerners. So people who want to sit aren't doing anything abnormal. My dog sits all day long. She sits in different places. She goes around the house sitting in one place and another place and another place. And we're not like excoriating her for being lazy. So what is it about humans? So it turns out that it's true that if you don't do physical activity, you get in trouble. You increase your vulnerability to a wide range of diseases, but it's not every minute you spend sitting is like this little clock ticking that ruins your life. It turns out that if you even just do epidemiological studies and look at the data, it's leisure time sitting, which is most strongly associated with poor health outcomes. So if you sit at work all day long and then in the evening go home and then sit on the couch and watch TV all night long and never get out and elevate your blood pressure and break a sweat, sure, then that's clearly not good for you. The kind of amount of sitting that most people do, 10 hours a day, is not terribly unhealthy. And furthermore, there's evidence that there's sort of different and better ways to sit. So this chair I'm sitting in right now is a back support, so I can lean back. And so I don't really have to use any muscles, and I'm basically quite still. But if you sit the way we evolved to sit, which is to squat or sit on the ground, you're squirming, you're fidgeting, you're moving, you're getting up every once in a while. And it turns out that those movements, and particularly the interruptions of sitting, have a lot of benefits. So it's a bit like, the analogy I use is a bit like turning the car engine on occasionally, just turning on the metabolism, the metabolic engines of your muscles. And that uses up some of the sugar in your bloodstream, the fats in your bloodstream. It turns on certain genes, etc. So interrupted sitting can really help people, but you don't have to. Standing desks are not exercise. Let's get that. Yeah, they may have some benefits, but it's not a substitute for getting out there and hiking up hills in San Francisco or going for a run or whatever.
Myth number 2: you need 8 hours of sleep every night.
I didn't expect to write that chapter, actually, but I was writing this chapter about sitting. I was like, why is it that we're told to sit less, but to sleep more? That was the question that was in my brain. And so I started looking in the literature, and to my astonishment, it turns out that this idea that everybody needs 8 hours of sleep is basically yet another one of these myths that has been propagated, basically to make people feel bad, either intentionally or unintentionally make them feel bad. And on every level, there are problems. So, for example, if you look at data on people who don't have electricity and iPhones and TV and all the kind of modern distractions that supposedly keep us from sleeping, they don't sleep that much. They sleep like 6.5, 7 hours max. And so there's no actual evidence that the Industrial Revolution and electricity has caused us to sleep less. In fact, if you go back in historical data, there's no evidence for that either. And then when you look at the epidemiological evidence, it turns out that people who sleep 8 hours on average actually aren't as healthy and don't live as long as people who sleep 7 hours. It's a U-shaped curve. And of course, there's a lot of variation, and not everybody's the same. And so there's no one magical sort of optimal number that everybody should dial into. The idea that 8 hours is optimal is just nonsense. And I think part of the problem is that we go to extremes. Like, it's true that insufficient sleep is a problem, right? People who don't sleep enough do have a wide range of problems, but instead of being honest with people, which is saying just get a bit more sleep, or try to get 7 hours, we come up with these rules, and then we make people feel not only bad, but we also make them stressed. And much of the chapter that I wrote is really about how stress affects sleep, because the enemy of sleep is cortisol, and cortisol is elevated by psychosocial stress. So if I told you your 7 hours of sleep is ruinous and you better do something about it, you're going to die, you're going to get stressed, and when you go to bed, you're going to be worried about it, and which is going to make you less able to sleep in the first place, and you set in motion a vicious circle. And then what do we end up doing? We end up buying sleeping pills and silly mattresses, and we turn our rooms into like caves that have no sound and light, etc. And of course, if that helps you sleep, fine. If you prefer, that's fine. But for most of human evolutionary history, people slept in piles on the floor and with people all around, and they did just fine. If you can sleep in an airplane, you can sleep anywhere. And people sleep on horses. We're not compassionate, and we stress people out on so many issues. And I think sleep is a really prime example.
Moving on to one of my favorite forms of exercise, walking. Myth number 3: you need to walk 10,000 steps every day to be healthy.
It's true that walking is really the most fundamental, basic form of human physical activity. If there's anything we've evolved to do, it's to walk. And all over the world, no matter where you go, people walk a lot until the invention of cars and kinds of labor-saving machines that have obviated the need for us to walk very much. And so typical hunter-gatherers walk, for example, 9 to 15 kilometers a day. That's 5 to 10 miles. If you add that up, that means that the average hunter-gatherer walks from California to New York every year. That's normal. That's what we evolved to do. And it's not exceptional. And just so happens that 5 miles is about 10,000 steps. But that 10,000 step prescription came from, it was just made up. It was actually a pedometer that was invented by a Japanese company right before the Olympic Games in Tokyo. And in a board meeting, they thought, let's set 10,000 steps. And it just turns out that just by luck, they happened to hit upon a pretty reasonable estimate of what people do. But there's no one dose. So there's no one number of steps that everybody should take. It's better to get more exercise than none, and a little bit more is yet better. But there's no sweet spot. There's no necessary number. But we've made exercise a kind of medicine. We prescribe it, and so we need to give people a prescription. Take 2 pills in the morning. Take 10,000 steps every day. And if that helps people, that's fine. But I think it also makes some people feel daunted. Not everybody's able to take 10,000 steps a day. I think people understand variation more than we give them credit, and that's just another example.
Myth number 4, running will destroy your knees and cause arthritis.
You asked about running. So if walking is the major form of sort of moderate physical activity that we evolved to do, running is the basic and fundamental form of vigorous physical activity that we evolved to do. And of course, we don't run as much as we walk. And today, people don't really need to run at all anymore because we don't have to hunt or scavenge or do things like that. So the kind of running has waned from human necessity. And today we mostly run for fun. A lot of people are afraid of running because there's this idea that running will ruin your knees. And it is true that the most common running injuries are in your knees, but it's not wearing away the cartilage in your knees, actually, that running causes. It's other kinds of knee damage, which I think there's compelling evidence, are caused by people running poorly. Because running is a skill, just like a lot of other physical activities, climbing trees or swimming or batting or kicking. There are better ways and worse ways to do it. And I think a lot of people today run really terribly because nobody teaches them how to run properly. And part of that is because of shoes, because the shoes that we wear are very cushioned and insulate our feet from the ground so you don't really feel what's going on. And when people wear cushioned running shoes, they basically run in a way they slam their bodies into the ground. You can hear it when people are running. They sound like elephants crashing with each foot into the ground. That sound is a collision. That collision is a shock wave that travels up your body and causes damage. And people who are barefoot can't do that. It hurts too much. So they run much more lightly and much more gently. It doesn't mean that you should run barefoot, but you can learn from barefoot running how to run better if you're wearing a shoe. And as for arthritis, there is no evidence that running causes arthritis. Actually, it's quite the reverse. The running actually promotes a healthy cartilage in the knee and actually may be preventative for arthritis. Of course, if you do get arthritis, then running will exacerbate it. So once arthritis sets in, then running is painful and really difficult to do. One of the ways it seems to help prevent arthritis is to be physically active, and it helps in a number of ways. In addition to preventing weight gain and inflammation, and arthritis is basically a kind of inflammation. That's an inflammatory disease. It turns out that running also promotes cartilage regeneration that we didn't think used to occur, but actually is really healthy. So if you're worried about your knees, learn to run properly, but don't worry that your running will cause you to have to get a knee replacement. That's just not true.
What about strength? Ask any CrossFitter or primal fitness enthusiast you know, and they'll tell you about our ancestors' super strength and their lean muscular bodies honed by a lifetime of natural movement and intense feats of strength, like lifting huge boulders or fighting off predators. Myth number 5. We evolved to be extremely strong.
Yeah, it's one of those myths that our ancestors were jacked. They're Arnold Schwarzenegger kind of strong. And we even have myths about chimpanzees. It turns out chimpanzees are strong, but they're not super strong. They're about maybe 30% stronger than a normal human being. So chimpanzees are stronger than humans, but they're not crazy strong. And people who have gone out and measured hunter-gatherers find out they're not super strong either. And And of course, that makes sense if you think about it, because muscle is really expensive. Muscles use up about as much energy as your brain, just sitting around, not doing anything with them. They're costly tissues. And that's why we have this kind of use it or lose it principle, right? We gain muscle when we need it, and we lose it when we're not using it because it's expensive to keep around. Remember, any calories you spend on useless muscle is calories that you don't spend on reproduction, which is the only thing that natural selection really cares about. So our ancestors were moderately strong, but not very strong. But the key thing is that they kept up their strength as they aged.
This part really surprised me because the idea that humans naturally get weaker and that we inevitably become less able to do things as we age is a pervasive myth. Our final myth, myth number 6, it's normal to be less active as we age.
So if you look at strength over age in non-Western versus Western populations, in Western populations, people can be reasonably strong in their 20s and 30s, but their strength declines rapidly as they age, and that leads to a problem called sarcopenia, or muscle wasting. And that's really a serious debilitating issue for a lot of elderly individuals, because as your muscles fade away, just basic tasks become harder. Getting out of a chair, going up and down the stairs. And when that sets in, then you get this vicious feedback cycle, because then you become less physically active. Then being less physically active means you then get further muscle wasting, and that causes a host of problems, metabolic, etc. But hunter-gatherers, since they don't stop being physically active as they get older, they don't lose strength as rapidly, and that helps them maintain their functional capacity as they age, which helps them be physically active in all kinds of other ways too, which then helps them stay healthy. U.S. Surgeon General and other medical advisory boards all recommend the same thing, which is that as we get older, it's important not only to keep up cardio, but also to do some weights. And that has enormous effects on people's health, especially as they age. So if you remember Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who recently just passed away, she was amazing. She died at the age of 87, but she was pumping iron, right? She was not doing crazy activities, but it really helped her stay vigorous and healthy for a long time. And one of the cool things is that there's lots of evidence which shows that it doesn't matter what age you are, your muscles still respond to loading as you get older. So that strength training really benefited her, and it'll benefit all of us.
So when we lift weights like RBG, or go for a hike, or swim, or dance, or run, we're generating a kind of stress in our bodies, at the molecular level, the cellular level, and in our tissues. We're even causing little cracks in our muscles and bones, and all of that damage has to be repaired.
Our bodies have all kinds of mechanisms that we've evolved that respond to those stresses, turn on repair and maintenance mechanisms that keep us healthy. Those mechanisms cost energy. And so after you exercise, for example, your metabolic rate is elevated for hours, sometimes days after you exercise. Most of that is actually other things your body's doing to help you deal with the consequences of having exercised. And the important thing is that we never evolved to turn on those repair and maintenance mechanisms as effectively without exercising, because our bodies never evolved to not be physically active. So if we don't engage in physical activity, we never turn on those mechanisms, at least not enough. And so we senesce more rapidly. We age in ways that cause us to deteriorate. We increase our vulnerability to a wide range of diseases. So it's the stress that actually is good for us, and because it keeps our bodies young and healthy. And sure, you can live to a ripe old age without exercising, but it's hard to do that without modern medicine. And we still get a wide range of chronic diseases that just never used to occur, or occurred in much lower frequencies. So diabetes and heart disease and osteoporosis and arthritis, and the list is really long. Physical activity helps prevent almost all of those diseases to an enormous extent, even many cancers. And so it's the absence of physical activity that prevents us from turning on those repair and maintenance mechanisms that help us not just have long lifespans, but also long health spans. That's the length of time in which we're vigorous and healthy and not suffering from illness.
So how can an evolutionary anthropological approach help us get out there and get some exercise when we don't feel like it? When our instincts tell us to just relax, take it easy?
The way in which we try to get people to exercise in the modern world is we've medicalized it, we've commercialized it. And that's not entirely inappropriate, and it has had some benefit, but it's clearly not functioning all that well. And the evidence is in front of us. But the fact that only 20% of Americans meet the minimum levels of physical activity that the government suggests is proof enough. It's not that those 80% of Americans who are sedentary don't know that exercise would be good for them. It's just that they struggle to do it. And I think so we need to find some other solutions because Fitbits and apps and statements like just do it, just don't work. We know that's not effective. So what can we do? So I think the first way that sort of an evolutionary anthropological approach can help us is to know that when you feel a lack of inclination, right? When you have an instinct that tells you not to exercise, I think it's very useful to know that's a deep and ancient instinct. There's nothing wrong with you, right? You're not lazy. You're doing what your body evolved to do, and that we now live in this modern world where we have to overcome that. And I think that's the first step. So understanding that there's nothing wrong with those instincts. It's just that we need to rationally overcome them. And there's 1,000 other things that we do that we overcome. And I think exercise is one of them. So I think that's the first step is just be compassionate with yourself and with others, right? Don't blame yourself and don't feel bad.
Dan says the second way an evolutionary approach can help is to recognize that we evolved to be physically active for basically two reasons: when it was necessary or when it was rewarding.
And so the best way to help yourself exercise is to make it necessary and rewarding. And I think the way to do that is to, first of all, avoid things that you don't like. If you don't like going to the gym and running on a treadmill, of course you're going to quit because it's torture, at least as far as I'm concerned. I don't know how people do it, but there are people who do it. It may be because they listen to a good podcast or something. And if that's what gets you to do it, fine. So one thing is to avoid what you don't like doing. But I think the other thing is to find ways to make it necessary and rewarding. And I think the best way of doing that is to make it social. I'll give an example. This morning, I went for a run at 6:30. It was dark. It was 12 degrees out there. It was windy. So the wind chill was probably like 10 degrees Fahrenheit. It was like a minus 11 or something Celsius. It was just awful. I did not want to go, but I had agreed the night before to go running with my friend Aaron, who lives a few blocks away from me. And he was going to be out there at 6:30. So I had to go. So I covered my body and I wore tights and gloves and hat and muffler and all that kind of stuff and headed out there. And the first mile was appalling. I did not enjoy myself, but we chatted and grumpily at first. And then as we warmed up, the conversation got more enjoyable. And at the end, when I got home, I was really glad I'd done it. And I rarely go exercising without being glad I did it at the end, but I never enjoyed the beginning ever. So making it social is really useful.
If you and your friends are not into running in the freezing cold, you could plan to meet up virtually for an online exercise class, or maybe a weekly Zoom dance party. Or call a friend and talk on the phone while you're taking a long walk.
There are 1,000 ways of doing it. And then I think the other way of making it necessary is to treat it like another kind of completely abnormal modern phenomenon, which is education. Kids don't like to go to school in many ways. And when they do, it's not because they're learning to do algebra or geography. They like it because their friends are there and it's fun. So school, we require it, but we also make it social. We make it necessary and we make it fun. And we also have a kind of a commitment contract with school. So think about what I do for a living. I'm a professor. So people pay money, like ridiculous amounts of money in some cases, to come to my university. And what do? I torture them. I make them read all kinds of things. I make them study. I give them exams. I grade them. If they don't do well, I give them a low grade. And they're paying for that privilege. And that's a commitment contract. And there are many ways to do commitment contracts. One is to sign up for school, or there are websites that enable you to do that, or just having friends, or agreeing to exercise with friends is a kind of way of making yourself accountable. And then I think the third and final way to use an evolutionary approach to help us exercise is to relax about time.
Dan says worrying about time is one of the most common reasons people give for not exercising.
We worry about not exercising. We worry about how much time we spend sitting. And I think an evolutionary approach helps us to relax about that, right? Because you don't need to exercise that much. And our ancestors weren't out there all day long, heaving rocks and running as fast as they can. They were just doing just a few hours a day of moderate activity. And like us, they spent most of the day sitting. And it turns out that you don't need a lot of exercise to get its benefits. Just a little bit goes a long way. And so chapter 11 shows the dose response curve to exercise. And just exercising an hour a week reduces your rate of mortality by about 30%, which is huge. Of course, do more, you get even more benefit. An hour and 50 minutes a week. So it's 21 minutes a day, right? That's all it is. It reduces your rate of mortality by about 50%. So you don't need to do an enormous amount. In fact, you can even cram it in by doing some high intensity interval training or something. Just get your heart rate up really rapid. That's the only kind of exercise you should do. If you only have a few minutes, getting out your heart rate up for a few minutes can have enormous benefits. So we should relax about time and dose. You don't need to do crazy amounts to get an enormous amount of benefit. And I think an evolutionary approach helps explain not only that's the case, but also why it's the case.
I hope today's episode leaves you feeling inspired and ready to start reaping the benefits of exercise while being kind and gentle to yourself all through the coming year. Dan Lieberman's book, Exercised, is coming out in the United States on January 5th. You can pre-order it at your local bookstore or online. Dan's giving a Leakey Foundation lecture at 7 p.m. Eastern on January 5th as part of his book launch. This online event is free, and it is produced in partnership with the Harvard Bookstore, the Harvard University Division of Science, and the Cabot Science Library. The link is in your show notes. I really hope you'll join us. Origin Stories is a project of the Leakey Foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to funding human origins research and sharing discoveries. You can support this show and the science we talk about by making a tax-deductible donation today. All donations will be matched, so your impact will be multiplied. Go to leakeyfoundation.org/donate. That's LEAKEY foundation.org. This episode was produced by me, Meredith Johnson. Our editor is Audrey Quinn. Theme music is by Henry Nagel. Additional music by Blue Dot Sessions and Lee Rosevere. Thank you so much for listening to Origin Stories this year. We'll be back in January with another episode.